All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today is February 3rd, 2021, and I'm back with another edition of the Wednesday show. Been a crazy market lately, but it's uh it's been interesting, that's for sure. So, let's take a look around indexes real quick here and then I'll move on. We actually have a handful of stocks that are triggering in this morning, and so I want to take a look at those. But um, first thing you'll notice is that the trend line that I had drawn here got violated ever so briefly on Friday, which was, but I mean, here's the thing. So, it's still, now it's a little sloppy because the trend line that has all these touch points, got kind of poked below or whatever. So theoretically, I could move it down to there, but I'm going to leave it where it was because it's still basically intact, right? So there was one day kind of poked below there. So yeah, this was almost qualifies as a dip that we had from the highs, but they just turned it right back around. So dip buyers pretty strong. We haven't seen any sort of a real sell off in the market since back here these couple of dips here. Let's see. So that was October 12th to October 30th. Yeah, so think about that. I mean, last fall was the last time that the market, even took what qualifies as any sort of a little pullback, really. So, dip, pullback, correction. When's the last time we saw a correction? It's been a while, right? Well, it's been a year since we had the big sell-off, but so anyway, um, since November, since the beginning of November, the market has just been sort of climbing up this little, what I would consider to be kind of a steep incline, and it's maintaining it. So um, just sort of a stone's throw away from new all-time highs. So, and I had the Qs up before. I mean, the Qs are basically the Nasdaq 100, basically right up at the all-time highs. So same sort of thing, climbing up this little incline. Got that one close below it, but there was no follow through on that, so that just shows that there's still money flowing in. So they're talking about GameStop on CNBC as usual. Look at that, absolutely crazy. I'm sure this was like national news. It's incredible that the short squeeze. There was the short squeeze. But here's the thing is, and it's still pretty amazing that it's up here as high as it is. So the price is just all over the map. But the thing about it is that what people don't realize, or what the people that were short squeezing it don't realize, is that eventually, when the shorts cover, then the thing has to come back down, right? So just some craziness. But yeah, there's been a lot of craziness in the market. I mean, the small caps have been doing pretty well, which is typically a healthy sign. So I have a little bit different of well, the incline, I guess is what I'm calling this today. Incline looks a little bit different on the Russell 2000. So because I had there was this little sort of dip right here, and so this latest little bit of a pullback that we had in the market didn't even touch the trend line, and here the Russell's acting strong again. So a lot of speculation in the market, a lot of yeah, well, apparently there's a lot of new traders, novices, that type of thing, and so typically in the bigger scheme of things, that doesn't necessarily always end well, but for now, it doesn't seem to matter, and obviously, liquidity is driving everything, and so, funny thing, I always mention this is that whatever I think the market's going to do, I tend to lean towards the side of caution and always have. But the cool thing about the system is that it doesn't care about that. It doesn't try and figure out what the market's going to do. It just basically takes technical chart patterns of individual stocks and looks for certain characteristics, and so that's what it does. So anyways, let's jump right in here because we've got these trades that are triggering today, and actually a handful of trades. It's kind of interesting. I guess the little dip that we saw and the subsequent rally has triggered in some of these stocks. So my guess is when we look at the charts here, and I've marked a little bit up on them. Let's start with the top here. MASI is kind of an expensive stock here. I didn't actually mark this one. Interesting. For some reason, I thought I had already marked this up, but I hadn't. So trigger 264. Interesting. So got this little pattern here. Hang on. There we go. 264. See if I can get that kind of accurate. And I'll go ahead and mark this one up. I know on some of the other ones last night when I did the update, I went ahead and just put the line where it goes. I figured I'd mark these up on the show today. So if you look at this chart, you got kind of a change in trend happening here. Hard to get that trend line where I want it, but yeah, so that was a pretty good dip actually in this particular stock. And so of course, the market and individual stocks are obviously going to have a lot different behaviors. Some days where the market, there was a few days recently where the market seemed to do okay, but a lot of the momentum stocks got hit. and you see that a lot. So anyway, when I look at this pattern here, what I see is obviously this is kind of a nice pivot low, right? Sold down, nice sort of pivot low, and yeah, the trend line broke back here, and you got a little bit of follow through. Now it looks like it wants to retrench just a little bit, but the stop is, let me mark that on here. Stop's down here at 247.50, so it's it gives it plenty of wiggle room, so to speak. So if indeed, and so that's kind of the nice thing about, let's see, that's the initial stop, 247.50. So the nice thing about, even though it's kind of selling down a little bit today, right, it could potentially form like sort of a little inverse head and shoulders looking thing here, but we'll have to see. So anyway, yeah, if the change in trend did indeed occur, if that pivot low and this move right here held, in which case you'll see this thing wiggle, maybe pull back a little bit, wiggle around, and then reverse back up and head back up here. So the target on this is well, the target doesn't look right in the. I'll have to double check that. Yeah, something doesn't look right there. But anyway, I'll make sure Jeffrey goes over and fixes that tonight. So let's move on here. That pattern wasn't really the prettiest one that I've seen, and so obviously picking and choosing amongst the triggered trades, you're going to find some that look a little bit better, like Square. This one I think actually has a pretty good looking pattern. So trigger 227, there we go. 227 even. Another case where you got like a perfect pivot low right there. This is actually got a really nice pattern. This particular stock has a tendency to take a dip, reverse, and sort of cup all the way back up to at least the previous highs or exceed them. So this one's got a pretty good look to it. Showing the target on this at 260. It looks like something might have been kind of weird in the system. That seems a little bit. I'm gonna have him double check the data on this. Sometimes and so you'll want to check this tonight. I'm gonna mark this target at 260 here, which will mean obviously that the stock's got to break out to a new high. But And if you look at this trend on this particular stock, each one of these little dips, once the dip kind of runs its course, it's pretty much buyable, right? It's looking good. The only little caveat that I see here is it's not really that much of a caveat, but you do have a little bit of a lower low there. And so there's actually kind of a channel going on here, right? A little bit of a channel. If I put the trend line like that, it's kind of it's acting like it's gonna sort of break out of like this little wedge pattern here, and not looking too bad. Quite honestly, I'd be more inclined to put that upper trend line down like that, and so that kind of, if I put it like that, then you can see exactly why it looks like it's busting out here. So not looking too bad. Square obviously is, let's see, we're in earnings season here, so that's something to pay attention to. Square's earnings are not until 2/23. So I've looked at I went through real quick and double checked and made sure that none of the earnings were imminent. So, but they will be earnings on some of these stocks that are triggering in will be coming out in the not too distant future. So there you go. Might as well just mark that on here. That way the next time I'm looking at this. So, not a bad setup, quite honestly. The last time it took one of these little dips like this and reversed, it made a new high. So moving on, we have Nike. I knew I'd marked some of these, so Nike looking pretty good. The trigger was down here. Trigger was sort of down here on, and it got gapped over, so it's a little bit of a gap up, and all you have to do in that case is target here is 145, and so basically 136, 140, 136.50, 140. So yeah, you'd add $3.50 to the target here. I'm going to mark that up real quick so that we have it on the chart. That's how you treat the gap ups. There's actually a couple ways to treat the gap ups. One of them is that you just go ahead and get in. Another one is you take a half a position, set a limit order to get filled at the trigger price. The third option is actually to just set a limit order at the trigger price and see if you get filled, right? But so all three of those are valid, and the real sort of way that you compensate for everything is that you basically just add. So you'd add, if you just went in this morning with a $3.50 gap up, you just add $3.50. So that'd be 148.50 would be the target here to compensate for this morning's gap. So we just put that up here. See target 148.50. Mark this target 145 so that we have it there. So not looking too bad. Nike actually took a pretty decent little bit of a orderly sort of dip there, right? You see there was a trade on Nike back over here, worked out pretty well. That was more of like a 2-month long kind of sell-off that happened back there, and then the price broke out of this little triangle and made a pretty good move there. So, and then this looks obviously like earnings came out, so Nike has a weird earnings schedule. It doesn't have anything to do with earnings season, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm not showing Nike's coming out with earnings anytime soon. Anyhow, not looking too bad here. It's kind of it was more of a quick sell-off and starting to rebound here. as opposed to the last time, but not looking too bad. Let's see, FATE, Fate Therapeutics. That's an interesting chart pattern. And it was kind of, it was kind of tight, and then once it made this move, which obviously this looks like news of some sort. Biotech's been pretty hot lately, so certain biotech stocks. Yeah, and so this is a sort of a typical chart pattern. There's sell off, almost a perfect pivot low. Let's see, trigger price on this is 96. And so let's see, opened at 99.20. So same deal. Add a little bit to the add the difference there to the target that you see. So let's see where the stop's going to go on this. The stop on this is actually down here at the low of the pivot low. So it's got a pretty good looking pattern to it too. You know, these trailing stops, sometimes they'll start off like this, right down at the very low of the pivot low. Sometimes they're a little bit above it. It just depends on whatever the system calculates, but they move quick, right? So, I mean, this stop could literally, well, depending on what the stock does today, right? It's got to get some forward motion going, some traction in the direction of the move, but within a couple of days, if we get a little bit of forward movement here, my guess, like if it went back up today, if it closed up here, maybe tomorrow, but this stop's going to probably come up pretty quick to under, somewhere under the lows of the day after that pivot low. So not looking too bad there. Not looking too bad at all. It does not need to make a new high to hit the target, although compensating for this little bit of a gap here, the target's going to be right up around the high. So let me just mark the regular target on here, and I'll change the color of it later on next time I come over here. 115. So somewhere right now, neighborhood right there, a little bit lower than that. So there we go. That looks doable. A lot of times these are always kind of nice. Whenever the target is above the prior highs, I won't say that it's going to have more difficult. It's going to have a little bit more difficulty, but I won't say that, because a lot of times that's sort of the characteristic of these stocks, is that they have a little bit of a pullback and then they resume the trend higher and they go on to make a new high. But other times when you get sort of this is pretty deep pullback here, and a lot of other times you'll retrace about 3/4 of the move, or you'll retrace the move like right around to the previous highs, and then the stock it'll begin to stall out a little bit because there's overhead resistance that it needs to get through. So, and last but not least is IOVA, which looks like there was another biotech stock. So it looks like there was this was one that really made a good move last time. So you can see this sell down here was pretty. I remember this last one over here because this was actually the ideal pattern where you got this sell down and then you got real tight price action that was kind of sideways for a few days, then the trend reversed. So, and here's what I was talking about. If you look at this prior trade back here in November, you'll see when it sold down, triggered in, and then this target was like basically right up at the previous high, and you can see that didn't even matter. It basically just ripped right through it and went on to make another high. So we'll see what happens this time. Keep in mind that the trigger price itself, which on this one is 45.20, the trigger price is basically just it's just a level. in the market. And so that particular level may or may not, the price is not necessarily going to respect that level. We're looking for a close over that level, right? So you can see that it kind of the level made sense, right? It just so happens that yesterday the stock had a big giant long range day. So this would be one where you don't necessarily have to just jump in right at the open when you see a stock that has a significant, you know, when it triggers in on a long range day like this, like it did yesterday. And so, this morning we got this fairly significant gap up. And so let me go ahead and mark the stop on here, which is going to be 40.75. So that's going to be down around the lows there. It's always kind of nice when the stop starts off at the pattern lows. The initial stop, because that way, basically, if the change in trend is valid, then it's not going to penetrate whatever the prior low was. I mean, it's just sort of it's like sort of like basic concept of technical analysis, right? And so that's what the system's doing, is it's saying, hey, this stock just had a decent pullback, and then it started, and then it's beginning to have a change in trend. Well, if this thing closed at 45.50 yesterday, then it could have triggered in this morning, like right around where the change in trend was actually, sort of confirming. And that's what we look for too. The reason we're using the closing price is because we're looking for a confirmation in the change in trend. Because a lot of times you'll see a stock like attempt to rally, and then all of a sudden, maybe poke through previous highs several times, and then all of a sudden, just fails. Like the change in trend doesn't actually materialize, just because the stock's trying to rally on an intraday basis. And so, as I've mentioned all the time here on the show, we're looking for a confirmation in the change in trend, which basically is a close above the the trigger line, as Jeffrey describes it, is like a barrier, right? It's sort of if the stock can't make it above that, if it can't close above that, then change in trend is not confirmed. So, interestingly enough, just to point this out, let's go back in time. When this triggered in last time, it was the exact same thing, right? So here's what happened, and this was back last November. So you can see the trigger was right here at 38, and it triggered in on this big long range bar, right? And so the following morning, it opened at 39.77. Right, and then subsequently, retraced the whole thing practically. And so, for a start off like that, you think that, well, boy, that was that was a pretty big gap. And so I drew all that stuff on here too. There was the target, there was the compensation target. So I just basically folded back over, and then you can see that it actually worked out pretty darn good. So literally, like the following day, it had a follow through long range day higher, and then look at that. It didn't take long for it to make the move. Now the setup going into it was a little bit cleaner than it is right now, but it's just a good example of why you don't necessarily want to sweat the small stuff. Now, here's the thing: is that when they gap up and open, and then you sit there for a few minutes and watch it start to fade, kind of like it is right now, you might be able to take a position a little bit closer to the trigger. And so But I've seen this before too. I do the show here in the morning, and the market's acting like it's a little bit weak this morning. So I mean, it just has had a big run up. So anyway, you get like a gap up, a little fade down, and then later on in the day it turns back around, and you end up here. So don't necessarily want to sweat the small stuff. The other thing I wanted to look at real quick. I'm going to do a quick show today. Just wanted to go over these stocks that are triggering in here, and let's see. There was like a couple other things I wanted to look at. Oh, one was I wanted to look at like these couple of closed trades that we just had, right? Like mRNA, right? The mRNA that ended up, boy, that was actually a really good sort of entry, follow through the whole 9 yards. But what's crazy about this is that the trailing stop, at one point, this thing was up like, I think it was like 44% or something crazy like that. So it ended up with like a 23% move from the trigger price to where it nicked the stop. But yeah, it was kind of with all this crazy sort of market action, right? Yesterday was one of those days where it came down and just, the low there, what was the low? 147.10. Stock like this just barely nicked the trailing stop, which is ideally the trailing stop. The purpose of it is that and you've seen this before, it hangs back just far enough that it's not going to get knocked out on normal price fluctuation. However, in this case, you can see that the stock really it kind of went parabolic there, right? Really made that big move. So, and then, it sold down as normal, but this low here kind of undercut these previous lows, and so it turned out pretty good. I mean, that was a huge move, right? Um, but it's just kind of weird how that happens sometimes. Comes down and just nicks the stop, which had moved up considerably, and then like I was just referring to, where sometimes you get the weakness early in the day and then it reverses, right? So yesterday this thing would have looked horrible when this was red, which is probably shortly after the open, and then it recovered it all, and kind of looks like, well, at least today it's coming back up into here. So when you see this sort of pattern, it's hard to it's hard to know if it can sort of climb back up towards these highs or if it's gonna actually go into pullback mode here. So, but anyway, that turned out to be a really good swing trade there, and so you can never complain about a double-digit gain. The other one that had the big move and sort of looks like it's in pullback mode now is Neo, right? It's another extremely volatile stock, and so you can see the entry was back over here after the trend line break, and you can see what all transpired. And quite honestly, now the stock does look like it's sort of starting one of these sell-offs. Actually, it's more of a consolidation than anything. It's not really. I don't know that this really qualifies as much of a sell-off. It's still kind of a shallow sort of dip here that's happening. But anyway, it came down obviously, and that was last Thursday. Came down and tagged that stop. And then, of course, that was right at the low of the day, and then it bounced a little bit, but definitely took it out. Even today, it's traded a little bit below where that stop was. So, um, up here, you can see there was a parabolic stop right under that huge gap up day there that would have gotten taken out right here. So that kind of makes sense. But anyway, it's never it's never a good idea to look back and say, well, could have done this or that. So I mean, this was a very respectable gain in this particular stock, and it was open for quite some time. So anyway, it may set up again. this type of pullback that you see here sort of had the magnitude to set it up for a change in trend. What we're seeing here is basically what I would call more of a consolidation. So has it closed the gap? Yeah, it has. So there's a little gap over here, sort of a breakaway gap, and it has closed that. So let's see. There was one. This I may take this out, or I may ask Jeffrey if he just wants to take this thing out of take this thing out of the universe, so to speak, because it's got really super low volume for one thing. It does not trade a lot, and it's it's got a halfway decent pattern, but it's just kind of random, and so you can see that triggered in, got some decent traction for a couple of days, hit a new high, and then basically just gapped up and gave it back, and now it's just floundering around. Um, it's sort of an interesting case because the initial stop still hasn't been hit, but this is basically this ETN. I mean, it's basically like instead of coffee futures, it's just an ETN, like which is similar to an ETF for the price of coffee. And the low volume means that it's kind of gappy, and I'm just not a huge fan of lower volume type of ETNs, and so. But anyway, yeah, that thing it just got stopped out. Here's another one that sometimes they trigger in and everything looks good and they still make a decent move, but this one just was it's kind of like what it did over here, right? There's a pretty good symmetry to it. So over here it broke the trend line, rallied up, close to the prior highs, then took a little dip and then continued to rally, whereas this time it just came all the way back down, right? Like it broke the trend line, nice little rally, and so this this extra sort of day down as compared to here, it just backed and filled a little bit, and then the trend up resumed, but didn't happen this time. It actually even looks like it took out the prior low there. So this could turn into some W pattern. I actually thought this one had a good look to it. One of the problems with sort of these V reversals, like a V reversal like this, is that it still carried pretty well, but it just couldn't. It didn't quite carry all the way back to the highs or past them, and then, like I said, that dip. So but fortunately the stop moved up, and so the percent on this was less than 5%. So that's kind of when I look at the closed trades, I see 20%, 20%, minus 3%, minus 5%, and so that's kind of that's the idea there, is that you cut your losses short and you let your winners run, and then so if we can end up with some stocks that make huge gains, and then other ones that the follow through just kind of fails on the chart pattern, well then no big deal, quite honestly. So that's kind of the idea. And that's the whole purpose of the trailing stop too, is get that trailing stop up as quickly as possible. And so when the trailing stop, gets close to break even or whatever, there's no risk on it. And so, some of them are going to come back down and not quite get it, but it's like, it's like fishing. So sometimes you catch the big fish, and sometimes it gets away, or you don't catch anything. And so the idea is to pretty much minimize the stop outs, right? So there you go. A few of the stocks that are triggering in today. Today, doesn't look all that exciting. The market itself is kind of, I noticed when it opened, in the half hour before I did the show, it just basically sort of chopped up and down, not really doing a whole lot. So Um, well, we just had a lot of action. We had actually like 4 or 5 kind of long range days in a row there. The big down action and then right back up. The last 2 days were pretty significant as far as gains go. And so today, we've opened right up here around the previous high, and so they're selling it down a little bit, right? No big surprise. Today may end up being kind of a dull day, so we'll just have to see. So anyway, well, thanks for tuning in. There's no huge rush. You can sort of look through the charts and maybe zoom into a smaller time frame on some of the ones that are triggering in. And a lot of times I like to use like an hourly chart, right? Looking pretty good on the hourly chart. I kind of like the look of this square. Um, this is a pretty hot stock. There we go. Whenever I zoom into a 60-minute chart, I always have to sort of adjust the trend lines, but it's got a pretty decent look to it. So this stock is, I mean, it's definitely headed back in the right direction. And so even if there's a little bit of a pullback or whatever, it looks like it has some pretty decent promise to it. So that's got a very nice look to it. So anyway, that's sort of the idea is, a little bit of picking and choosing on which ones you want to actually take. It's not a bad idea. So um, only caveat on this one is that it's already, it's made a pretty significant move past the pivot low here, and so there may be a little bit of retrenching. But as you can see, as we're speaking here, actually it's a real-time quote 225.89, and so it's actually below the trigger now. So another little trick you could use is that if it comes back up over the trigger, you could get in right at the trigger. But if it doesn't, like, say the market's gonna fold over and sell off a little bit today, and this comes down, this trigger be valid tomorrow, right? And so at this point, you could wait for a move till you see a move up that hits the trigger at 227, and then jump in there. And so that'd give you a pretty good entry there, right? So we may see a little bit of a backing and filling in the overall market. Maybe some of these stocks come down below the trigger and then rally back up. So it just depends. But not a bad looking pattern there, and still plenty of time. Another thing on this is that we could potentially, if the market cooperates, we could potentially see like a pre-earnings run up. That happens a lot. You'll see stocks that run up ahead of earnings, and then when the earnings come out, sometimes then they might either sell off or gap up or whatever. I'm sure that there's going to be significant volatility in a stock like this around earnings, but could see a decent little run up ahead of earnings. So kind of like the look of it here. But so anyways, hey, thanks for tuning in. I will see you guys back here same time, same place next week.